The mistake wasn't sending 30 men. The mistake was sending them in daylight. In Medellín, daylight belonged to routines. Shopkeepers opening shutters, buses coughing up smoke, vendors shouting prices into warm air. Violence preferred night. Night had ambition. But when a rival syndicate decided to challenge Pablo Escobar, they chose noon deliberately. They wanted visibility. They wanted witnesses. They wanted the city to see Escobar tested. The men they sent weren't amateurs. They were disciplined, experienced, pulled from different crews to avoid recognition patterns. 30 of them, spread across vehicles, armed, coordinated, briefed. Their objective wasn't assassination. It was occupation. They planned to roll through key intersections, occupy known safe zones, force minor lieutenants into submission, and prove something dangerous. That Medellín could be entered without permission. At 11:17 a.m., the first convoy entered the northern district. 2 SUVs. 1 sedan. Windows darkened, but not subtle. They didn't need subtle. They needed spectacle. Pedestrians slowed. Shop owners paused mid-transaction. The city felt the intrusion immediately. Inside one of the SUVs, a man named Herrera adjusted his jacket and glanced at his watch. 30 minutes, he said. We hold the corridor. He believed that was enough. He believed Escobar's network would scramble in confusion. He believed numbers created momentum. Across the city, Pablo was seated at a modest office table reviewing documents. Sunlight streamed through half-open blinds, cutting the room into narrow bands of gold and shadow. He didn't look alarmed when the first call came in. 3 vehicles, armed. Northern District. Pablo nodded once. Second convoy approaching Central. He set the paper down. How many? Estimate 30 total. Pablo leaned back slightly. 30, he repeated quietly. The man delivering the update waited for visible reaction. There was none. Instead, Pablo stood. He walked to the window and looked down at the street below. Ordinary life continuing, unaware of how close it was to disruption. Where are they focusing? He asked calmly. Corridor between the old market and the textile warehouses. Pablo smiled faintly. That corridor. They had chosen poorly. Because that stretch of road wasn't just busy. It was watched. Not by uniformed guards. By vendors. Drivers. Store owners. Mechanics. Men who owed Pablo favors. Women whose sons had received help. People who didn't carry guns, but carried phones. Phones that were already dialing. By 11:26 a.m., word had spread faster than the convoy itself. They're moving through the north. They're stopping at the mechanic's corner. They're asking questions. Herrera stepped out of the SUV at the second intersection, boots hitting pavement with deliberate weight. His men fanned out efficiently, positioning themselves with visible confidence. He signaled toward a warehouse door. Open it, he ordered. The warehouse manager hesitated. A gun lifted slightly. The door opened. Herrera walked inside expecting compliance. Instead, he found emptiness. No stash. No men. No sign of panic. He frowned. Outside, something subtle had shifted. Shutters closed, but not in fear. In rhythm. Cars that had been parked casually now angled differently. Pedestrians who had been walking aimlessly now stood in doorways. Herrera didn't notice. Not yet. At 11:31 a.m., Pablo stepped out of his office. He did not rush. He did not shout orders. He made 3 calls. Each one under 10 seconds. Each one precise. Block the east exit. Redirect the buses. Close the market. He hung up. Bring the cars, he said quietly. Back in the corridor, Herrera's men began sensing something wrong. Not gunfire. Absence. No police. No resistance. But no submission either. Feels off, one of his men muttered. Herrera dismissed it with a wave. Stay visible, he ordered. That's the point. Visibility. That was the flaw. At 11:38 a.m., traffic thickened unnaturally at both ends of the corridor. A delivery truck stalled at the north exit. 2 buses halted at the south. Herrera's SUV found itself boxed between civilian vehicles. What is this? One of his men muttered. Then the first sound came. Not a shot. A whistle. Short. Sharp. It echoed between buildings. Herrera turned. From rooftops, figures appeared. Not 30. Not 40. Enough. Not uniformed. Not identical. But positioned with terrifying familiarity. Herrera's chest tightened. They hadn't walked into open territory. They had walked into a net. Pablo's car rolled into view at the far end of the street. Slowly. Deliberately. He stepped out, adjusting his jacket. Not hurried, not armed visibly, just present. Herrera's men shifted nervously. They had expected panic. They had expected chaos. Instead, they saw coordination. Pablo walked forward a few steps, stopping where the sunlight cut across the asphalt. "You brought 30, he called out calmly. His voice carried without effort. Herrera tried to steady his breathing. "This isn't your city anymore," he shouted back. Pablo tilted his head slightly. "Then why are you standing in my shadow?" The rooftops shifted subtly. Not dramatic movement, but enough to make Herrera understand the geometry. They were exposed, surrounded, in broad daylight. And every civilian within sightline now witnessed something else entirely. Not invasion. Correction. Herrera glanced at his men. Confidence drained visibly. They had entered expecting dominance. Now they were calculating escape. Pablo took another step forward. "Leave," he said calmly. "Now." Herrera hesitated. Pride wrestled survival. A gun twitched upward in one of his men's hands. Immediately, a laser appeared against the SUV windshield. Then another. Then several more. Herrera swallowed. He hadn't counted rooftops. He hadn't counted windows. He hadn't counted loyalty. He realized, too late, that they had misjudged something fundamental. Medellín didn't just belong to Pablo by force. It belonged to him by structure. And they had walked directly into it. The first of Herrera's men lowered his weapon. Then another. Then the entire formation fractured. The spectacle they had intended to create dissolved into retreat. Engines revved. Vehicles struggled to maneuver through the boxed corridor. Delivery trucks moved slowly, too slowly. Buses delayed just enough. The 30 men scrambled back into their cars under watchful eyes from every angle. By 11:52 a.m., the corridor was clearing. Herrera's convoy exited the district, shaken and silent. Pablo remained standing in the sunlight for a moment longer. He looked around at the rooftops, the windows, the vendors reopening shutters. Then he nodded once. The rooftops emptied. The whistles stopped. The city resumed. By noon, traffic flowed normally again. Shopkeepers reopened. Children crossed streets. And word spread with surgical speed. They sent 30 of their best. And by noon, the streets belonged to Escobar again. But what Herrera didn't understand yet was that this wasn't over. Because humiliation in daylight demanded something final. And Pablo Escobar never allowed challenges to end quietly. By the time Herrera's convoy cleared the southern exit, the damage had already been done. Not to buildings, not to bodies, to perception. 30 armed men had rolled into Medellín in broad daylight expecting dominance. They left under watch. Watch from rooftops. Watch from balconies. Watched by shopkeepers who had reopened their shutters as if nothing extraordinary had happened. The humiliation was surgical. Herrera sat in the back seat of the lead SUV, jaw tight, eyes fixed forward. No one in the vehicle spoke. The engine noise filled the silence where confidence used to live. They had not fired a single shot. That made it worse. Because gunfire could be explained. Retreat without engagement could not. At 12:08 p.m., word reached their sponsors, the rival syndicate that had approved the test. What happened? The answer came in fragments. Too many eyes. Too coordinated. Trapped without warning. What about casualties? None. That last word carried weight. None. They had expected blood. Instead, they received exposure. Back in the northern district, Pablo Escobar walked through the corridor slowly. The market had resumed full volume. Vendors called out prices. Children chased one another between stalls. Mechanics returned to their tools. Life restored. That was the real victory. Not violence. Continuity. One of his lieutenants approached quietly. "They'll try again," the man said. Pablo nodded. "Of course they will. Do we move on them now?" Pablo paused beside a fruit stand, picking up an orange, weighing it thoughtfully in his hand. "If we chase every insult," he said calmly, "we become reactive." He placed the orange back. "They came to show strength," he continued. "Instead, they showed weakness." He began walking again. "They'll feel pressure from their own side now." That was the deeper play. Humiliation travels upward. Herrera's sponsors would question his execution. Herrera would question their intelligence. Trust fractures under daylight embarrassment. And fractured rivals rarely coordinate well a second time. But Pablo wasn't naive. He knew pride demanded an answer. By mid-afternoon, the rival syndicate convened privately. Voices rose behind closed doors. Some demanded immediate retaliation to reclaim credibility. Others urged caution. A second failed display would destroy them entirely. Herrera stood silent in the room. He knew what they were thinking. He had felt the geometry collapse around him in real time. He had seen the rooftops fill like a stage reveal. He had heard whistles signal invisible coordination. They hadn't invaded a city. They had entered a system. And systems, once activated, didn't break easily. At 3:42 p.m., Pablo received confirmation that internal arguments were spreading within the rival camp. He didn't smile. He simply adjusted his jacket. "Prepare the statement," he said. There would be no press conference. No announcement. Just whispers placed strategically. They came. They left. That's all. By evening, the story had taken its final shape across Medellín. They sent 30 of their best. They were boxed in by the street itself. They left without firing. The phrasing mattered. Not Escobar attacked. Not Escobar retaliated. Escobar held. That distinction reshaped loyalty more effectively than any bullet. Night fell over the city with unusual calm. Even law enforcement noticed the absence of chaos. Reports mentioned suspicious vehicle movement, but no confirmed violence. That quiet unnerved some observers, because they expected escalation. But Pablo understood escalation was unnecessary. The demonstration had been sufficient. Later that night, Herrera requested a private audience through intermediaries. That alone spoke volumes. The meeting was arranged in neutral territory once again, not a garage this time, but a rooftop overlooking the city. Herrera arrived first. No entourage, no weapon visible. When Pablo stepped onto the rooftop minutes later, he carried no visible guard either. They stood facing one another with Medellín glowing behind them. "You could have ended us," Herrera said quietly. "Yes," Pablo replied. "Why didn't you?" Pablo looked out at the city lights before answering. "Because endings create martyrs," he said calmly. "Correction creates memory." Herrera absorbed that. "You embarrassed us." "You embarrassed yourselves," Pablo corrected gently. A long silence followed. Herrera exhaled slowly. "They'll want blood. Then they should send it at night," Pablo said evenly. "Daylight belongs to structure." Herrera almost smiled despite himself. He understood now. This wasn't bravado. It was architecture. "You win," Herrera said finally. Pablo shook his head slightly. "This wasn't a contest," he said. "It was a lesson." The rooftop wind carried the city's distant sounds upward. Traffic, music, laughter. Normal life. Herrera nodded once and stepped back. There would be no second daylight invasion. The rival syndicate quietly redirected focus to other territories, other cities where structure was weaker. Medellín remained intact. In the following weeks, loyalty tightened. Vendors felt safer. Smaller crews reaffirmed alliances. The market corridor became almost symbolic, a place where daylight proved something permanent. And whenever newcomers asked why no one challenged Escobar openly anymore, the answer came simple and consistent. They tried once. No one needed more detail. Because what mattered wasn't how many men had arrived. It was how many had left unchanged. 30. And by noon, the streets had belonged to Escobar again. Not through massacre, through mastery.